Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to talk about a much-loved book, which is Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. This book came out in 2017, and I'm pretty sure that's when I first read it. But we've been in a bit of a slump in book club, and so a couple of folks in the book club who had already read Pachinko were down to reread it just so that we could get a solid novel under our belts. So in this video, I'm just going to talk a bit about what the experience was like having reread the book and some of the kind of interesting ideas that we talked about when we were discussing the book in book club. I first read this book and absolutely loved it. I think that was the first kind of multi-generational family novel that I had read, and in the beginning I was just so hooked in the way that Min-Jin Lee is kind of using like a very broad paintbrush to sketch this picture of this family. Like, she's describing such lofty and like broad phenomena of history, but at the same time it's about this very specific family and these very specific characters, and it just felt really bold and really captivating. I just remember like starting to read about Sunja, who is one of the first characters we learn about. We actually start the story with Youngjin, which is her mother, but just feeling like so hooked onto this character. So my experience reading this the first time around was really just not knowing much about the Pacific theater of World War II, because I'm American and we're not really taught that in high school. Knowing nothing about the experience of the Zaichini, who are the Koreans that stayed on in Japan after the war was over, and finally just never really having experience reading something that kind of spanned so many generations in one family. Those kind of elements combined just really made for this extremely like impactful reading experience, where I not only was so hooked into the plot and the characters, but I also was like learning a ton. So if you don't know, Pachinko tells the story of Sunja and her mother, but also her sons and their son, over the course of almost 100 years, I think, somewhere around there. And she is living in Korea during the time of colonization by the Japanese. Japan annexed Korea, I believe, in 1910. And then she moves with her husband, Isak, to Osaka, and then they stay there even after the war. So they become Koreans that even her son is born in Japan, but they have this kind of gray area status because they still hold Korean passports. But her next generation, born in Japan, raised in the Japanese way, I suppose, or they go to Japanese schools, speak Japanese. So this kind of experience is critical to how each of the characters, especially the younger characters, understand their identity and also grapple with their identity. I think the first time around, that theme of having some kind of conflicted identity or never being Korean enough or Japanese enough or having some kind of mixed identity really resonated with me. The second thing that really resonated with me is just how Min-Jin Lee depicts the quiet strength of the women. And, you know, everyone suffers in this book, and the men really work hard as well, and they really are devoted to their ideals, and they really try to take care of their families. But what I think Min-Jin Lee does really well is to kind of spotlight the quiet strength of the women, even though they were operating under so many constraints, not supposed to work outside of the home, very conservative Asian values, as well as just like the values of the time. They still provide for their family, they problem solve. And I also really like the moral ambiguity. I really don't feel that Min-Jin Lee is saying like this decision was correct or that decision was incorrect. She more paints these kind of morally ambiguous or complex characters, both in Sunja, who makes some very impactful decisions that impacts the rest of her family and their trajectory, as well as Hansu, which is kind of like her benefactor and also the father of her first son and not the man that she's married to. Hansu in many ways is like the benefactor, the patron, or the person behind the scenes who's really helping them survive. But I do feel like Min-Jin Lee is putting a question mark there in terms of whether that is good. And there are like definitely downsides to how Hansu influences the trajectory of this family. I also think Min-Jin Lee refuses to fall into easy traps. This is something we talked about in book club. I think some common pitfalls for a very emotional, wartime, multi-generational story like this is to show like extremely violent or almost sensationalized scenes. So for example, like, you know, being tortured by the Japanese, or maybe having a scene where like comfort women are depicted, or having like very tense familial relationships. And it's not as if Lee doesn't include those things, but I feel like she does it in a way that's a lot more natural and human, especially in the first part of the book. So one example that I really like is that when Sunja moves in with her husband and her brother-in-law, she is a little bit nervous about whether her brother-in-law's wife, Kyung-hee, will like her. And I just love that it didn't turn into a, oh, my sister-in-law hates me and this is difficult relationship to navigate. Instead, they become like instant sisters, and the bond of their friendship and their female friendship really is what keeps Sunja and holds together the family. So for me, that was like a personal example where I was like, oh, it's such a relief that like these two women actually are sisters and get along, rather than there being some easy source of conflict. I think rereading the book was a great experience, especially getting to discuss it then with book club. Some really interesting insights from all of my book club members, but I'm not gonna like, you know, call them out on YouTube, but I will just like attribute these thoughts to them in general. One of my friends, I think, felt that some of the storylines and the characters were a bit forced, and he thought that Lee was kind of just inserting this character in order to represent a certain idea that she wanted to get across. And I kind of agree with him. I think in general, I much prefer the first half of this book to the second half. When Lee gets into the modern era, it does feel a little bit forced. I mean, you do have some storylines around one of Musasu's, or Moses's, childhood friends coming out of the closet and grappling with his identity as a queer man, but also a policeman in the Japanese police force. There's also another younger character who is a prostitute, and I feel like all of these characters just kind of came in so that Min Jin Lee could include some thoughts or a storyline, but it didn't really feel natural. It kind of felt like they were there just to drive the plot along. The other thing that's really fun about reading with a book club is that there is actually someone in the book club who, we had someone who was Korean but grew up in Russia. I actually have 3 Singaporeans in my book club, and then a couple of Americans. I myself am American, so I feel like when you discuss a book with other people from different backgrounds, it's just a totally different experience. And that's actually something that came up when we were discussing the book, because I think as an American, we really are not taught very much about the Pacific theater of the Second World War. But according to my Singaporean friends, they were like hit over the head with that history in their curriculum. And so I feel like that's kind of why my friend felt that some of the plot points were a little bit heavy-handed, because to him, these are like things that he's heard of his whole like educational career, whereas to an American audience, it's something new and told in a different light. So it was really interesting to hear like the thoughts of the other members of my book club. And so I definitely think that this is a kind of book that you can reread, and I really appreciated reading it a second time. So if you still haven't checked out Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, I highly recommend it. It's a 5-star book in my opinion. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Who is Korean but grew up in Russia. We had this cat is crazy.